see names and different cities and states and the different work that's represented in our space today. All right, hi everyone. Again, welcome to today's webinar. This is Louis Marvin, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the training specialist with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Today, we are very pleased to present this conversation on meaningful incorporation of survivors and people with lived experience in your agency's work as part of the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. We are joined today by panelists from 3 different organizations who you'll meet in just a moment. And those organizations are Voices of Women in New York City, the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, based in Harrisburg, where I am also located, and the Downtown Women's Center and DV Homelessness Services Coalition in Los Angeles. I'm also joined by my colleagues, Chris Bilhart and Jenny Hegret from the National Alliance for Safe Housing. And just before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. The first thing is that there is a link in the chat that we'll kind of keep posting for those of you who would like to follow the caption of today's webinar. And that's typically on the right-hand side, the chat screen. If you haven't found it yet, you can access that if you click on the bubble that's at the bottom of the screen that says chat. You can also use the button that says CC and closed caption to view those captions. So that's your choice. You can use the CC button at the bottom of the screen, or you can follow the link that we're posting in the chat. And this webinar is going to be recorded, and we are recording now, and we'll share the recording with all of you following this webinar. We also wanted to just give you a quick note on possibly changing the name that's appearing on your screen, if that is something that you'd like to do for your own privacy or safety. We know that some people use their phones to call in, so especially if your phone number is what's popping up, you can hover over your participant name in the participant view, select more and rename. And also another note, when we aren't sharing the slide, like right now you can see a slide, you can go, you might want to change the view because we're just going to see the panelists' faces when our panel is speaking. So that might feel better. It might be a better view for you. So you can do that by hovering over the word view in the top right side of the screen, and you can select gallery view if you're on speaker view, and you can see the group of panelists then when we're hearing from our panelists. Okay, with that, I'm going to get started then with the presentation. As I mentioned before, the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, or DVHTAC, is a collaboration. It's a partnership among a number of federal partners, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program from the Office of Health and Human Services, the Office on Violence Against Women from DOJ, the Office for Victims of Crime from DOJ, the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs out of HUD, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And it's also through a great collaboration by the technical assistance providers, and that includes the National Alliance for Safe Housing, Collaborative Solutions, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And as part of the commitment of the consortium to racial equity and centering Black lives and Black survivors, we want to start by sharing this animated infographic with all of you that highlights the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous and other people of color in the homelessness space. So Jenny, would you start our video?
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system, to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it, so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to NRCBV for that video. So that helps with some of the context and background for this conversation today. As people in this work and as programs doing this work, we need to be centering racial equity. We know that there is a unique convergence right now of numerous public health crises. In addition to COVID-19, we're experiencing a reckoning around the systemic racism that is not new, but that maybe we might see playing out in some new ways or in some old ways. And those of us who work in the anti-violence movements know that in this context that we're living in, there's an increase in domestic and sexual violence. And that's all compounded by poverty and homelessness. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I know our panelists have some great models to share that you might borrow or learn from to do work in your communities. And we look forward to keeping the conversation going in the chat. We will have a question and response time. So yeah, today we're spotlighting those 3 programs I mentioned before that have found effective ways to ensure meaningful involvement of survivors and people with lived experience, including in decision-making and political advocacy work. And they'll be discussing how they enacted this commitment, the roles and supports available to survivors who get involved, and how they center the voices of Black and Indigenous and people of color and LGBTQ people, and what they see as the impact of survivor involvement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and to our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Louie. And welcome, everybody. We're very excited, and we've got a great group of folks that are going to be talking with you today, and hope that we can have some good dialogue and exchange in the chat, as well as among these great panelists. So we wanted to just, go through and show you the logos and the representatives of the organizations before we move just to a sea of faces. As Louie mentioned, we're going to be hearing from Voices of Women, which is located in New York City. And we've got Raquel and Charlena and Charlena from that organization with us today. And next we're going to be hearing from the Downtown Women's Center, which is one of the founders of the Domestic Violence and Homeless Services Coalition in LA. And we've got Amy and Lorraine from those organizations that we'll be hearing from, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a moment. And then we've also got with us today Amanda from the LGBT Center in Harrisburg, PA, as Louis mentioned earlier. So I think now that you've seen all the organizations and their amazing logos, we're going to switch to looking at some amazing faces and having a great conversation. And I wanted to open with a little bit more in the way of background on the folks that you see in front of you today. Let's start with Voices of Women, where we have Charlena Powell, who is a community organizer focusing on safe and affordable housing for survivors and developing community partnerships. She has done all kinds of stuff, including focus groups. She's testified at city council hearings. She teaches healthy eating and life skills development at juvenile detention centers. And she's the co-creator of New York City's borough-wide survivor town halls that were aimed at addressing critical issues that the pandemic brought to light. And I was able to sit in on one of those town halls, and it was amazing. And now we've got Raquel Singh from VOW, and she's a community organizer who's been working with DV survivors and child witnesses to redefine public policy and systems implementation, big system structural work. She served on the New York City DV Task Force, the New York City Fatality Review Committee, and she was appointed to the New York City Mayor's COVID-19 work group, specifically on issues around domestic violence and survivors. Raquel believes that survivors should not only have seats at decision-making tables, but they should be leading those meetings, crafting the policies, and being supported by the advocacy community to do that work. And before we move on to other introductions, Raquel and Charlena, I wonder if you could share with everybody just a little bit more about Voices of Women and its work. Oh, I think you're muted, Raquel.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll get started. So we were founded in 2000 by survivors of domestic violence and their advocates, specifically to address criminal justice reform. Survivors felt they needed a voice in court and they weren't being supported properly. So they had to identify ways in which they could organize to create not only policy change within the court system, but behavior and attitude change. And we then expanded to have a housing campaign and a child welfare campaign. These campaigns were identified by survivors as the most important areas when touch pointing with the system and dealing with abuse that they felt most re-victimized by. And so since then we've grown. We have a mix of survivors from all boroughs, and we are survivors of domestic violence and child witnesses. I'm a child witness to domestic violence. We are completely survivor focused, staff and in some ways affected, our board is in some way affected. We work from the lens of the survivor, and what that means is that the survivor leads our policy work. We don't work to lead the survivors, and it's always based on lived experience. And the focus of lived experience is the only way we feel that we can affect proper systems change for survivors of domestic violence and their children. Charlena, you want to chime in?
Sure. I identify as a survivor advocate. I've been working with VOW for about 5 years. And first I joined VOW as a member, and I actually got introduced to VOW from living in a domestic violence shelter. One of the counselors there, she led a book group. And after a while, she let me know that she was a part of this organization and how I can get involved and just stay connected with other sisters who have been through what I've been through. So when I joined VOW in like 5 years ago, and I went on to later, 3 years later, joining the team, joining the staff, and I've just enjoyed it ever since. And I like to say that I'm a survivor advocate, and I help other survivors see what I've been through and how to help them, especially in the current climate, because the survivor world is always changing. So I'm happy where I work, and yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. To continue with our intros, let's move to the LGBT Center of Central PA, and that would be Amanda Arbour. Amanda is a queer feminist with a deep passion for social justice. She really wants to continually develop self-awareness of her own identities, unlearn complicity in the oppression of others, and learn how to be in solidarity with marginalized communities. And as the ED of the LGBT Center of Central PA, she leads the efforts, the center's efforts to foster inclusive communities and holistic well-being for LGBTQ plus people through social, educational, and cultural engagement. We should say, and Amanda might point this out when I turn to her, that this is not a program that specifically works on domestic and sexual violence issues or housing issues specifically. That's not necessarily their mission, but those focuses are certainly enfolded in the work that they do and in the community that they work with. So I'll turn it over to Amanda to just tell us a little bit more about the LGBT Center. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be here with you all. So the LGBT Center of Central PA is based here in Harrisburg, and we serve 4 counties in the central Pennsylvania region. And our focus is, as Chris shared, to foster inclusive communities and holistic well-being for LGBTQ plus people, which we do through social, educational, and cultural engagement. And what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, our core programs are really focused around creating safer and more inclusive spaces for queer and trans people to find community connection and support. And so we have core programs focused around providing those spaces for LGBTQ youth, for older adults, for transgender and non-binary people, and queer and trans people of color. And we have a new program that we recently started that's specifically focused on creating spaces for LGBTQ plus men of color and trans women of color. That's in collaboration with several community partners. In addition to providing those spaces for folks, we also do significant training and education with businesses, schools, nonprofit organizations, so that we're not just creating spaces for people to come and to connect, but we're also really seeking to go out into our communities and into the other organizations within our region to create those more safer and more affirming spaces where people go to work, where people seek services, where people get an education. So that's really part of our mission as well. And while we don't specifically focus on sexual violence or domestic violence, because of the experiences of queer and trans people, many who participate in our programs have those experiences, and that's something that we seek to support in the context of the programming that we provide in collaboration with local organizations that specifically focus on that work. And we've also identified both racial justice and housing as 2 of our 4 key priorities in our current strategic plan. And so those are very much areas that we are working on to advance our mission here in Central Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Amanda. And I can't wait to hear more about how you're doing that, because I know you've got some great things to share. All right. And now we're turning to our West Coast representatives here who, like me, might still be, coffee might still be in the mix. The Downtown Women's Center. Amy Turk is the CEO of the Downtown Women's Center, which serves and empowers women experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles, the only organization in LA that does specifically that. Amy, has been instrumental to the Downtown Women's Center, just phenomenal growth and its implementation of many innovative projects, including the establishment of the Domestic Violence and Homelessness Services Coalition. So we're going to be hearing a lot more about that. Welcome, Amy. And we've also got Lorraine Cantley, who is the co-founder of the Housing Justice LA podcast. I hope you can put a link to that in the chat, Lorraine, because it's amazing. I would really encourage you all to listen in. It's great, great work. Lorraine is a renowned advocate and survivor of DV and homelessness, and she brings her unique expertise as a lived experience consultant to all kinds of things. The operations of advisory boards and steering committees, all around advancing the work on housing solutions And she really enjoys public speaking and also artistic expression as a means of liberation and healing. So welcome, Lorraine and Amy. And if I could turn to you to just give us a little bit more of an overview of the Downtown Women's Center and the DV and Homelessness Services Coalition.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. So nice to be together with this great panel. Downtown Women's Center has been providing services in the Los Angeles community since 1978, and we strive to end homelessness for women through housing that we own and operate, through mental health services, healthcare, drop-in services, and access to employment, both with us at Downtown Women's Center, especially in our social enterprise called Made by Downtown Women's Center, where women make handmade products like candles and soaps that are sold online and in our coffee shop and resale boutique. And we help find employment in the community for women that we serve too. And we really see ourselves as a direct service organization in our local application, but because of our proximity to the needs of who we serve, we have a national voice in our advocacy work. And one way we do that is through leading the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition. And that has grown in a co-partnership with a DV organization called Rainbow Services. We now are a coalition of 150 organizations and 400 individuals focused on creating a survivor-centered system to increase access to safe housing and services for individuals at the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness. And one of my most favorite aspects of the work is getting to work with Lorraine Cantley in particular, who I know can share more about the coalition's work.
Just want to thank you all for investing your time and being with us on this conversation today. And a disclaimer, I have a special guest who may pop in, who I've been trying to manage his distant learning while we're in the same space. Downtown Women's Center has been able to get really close to my son, Royalty. So not only am I a survivor of domestic violence and one who has lived through homelessness, I am a mother of 4 very creative and boisterous beings. So if he pops in, please just say hello. So I, in 2017, participated in the Corporation for Supportive Housing Speak Up program, where I got introduced to the Downtown Women's Center. And I immediately seen how the Downtown Women's Center focused on how the individual comes in with a need and they're able to share what that need is, and they have this sense of choice of what do they want to do next. And so that's how I got in this partnership with the Downtown Women's Center, participating in there was a trauma-informed action team where we talked a lot about how do we create a wider, broader aspect of trauma-informed practices in the community. And then we went on to centering the voices of survivors in the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition. And it has been a great journey in just seeing how survivors' lives have transitioned from being on one side of the services, receiving services, to now being more involved in the design and the way that programs and services are implemented. So thank you for all that you do when it comes to caring for how survivors experience the journey of healing.
Thank you, Lorraine. Wow, I'm tingling. This is such a great group. I think Louis and I are now gonna pitch some questions out to you all, and we'll take turns doing that, but we also want to kind of go where you want to go. So let's be flex. Louis, do you want to take us from here?
Sure, thanks, Chris, and thanks, everyone. Yeah, I guess maybe a good place to go next would be just what sparked or motivated your commitment to incorporate the expertise of survivors and people with lived experience as this kind of like core or essential part of the way that you do your work. So I know people sort of started to talk about that, but I know you have a lot more to say about that topic. So what sparked or motivated your commitment to doing that? Maybe we could go in the same order. So our panelists from New York, would you like to start us off?
So the work we do it's fully survivor-led. So that's how in its infancy, that was the original mission. It was to be crafted for survivors to affect systemic change. And the idea was that those survivors who have gone through the system are the experts, not service providers. And so for that reason, the belief was that the experiences that you go through really show how the system really works, not how the system claims it works. And so those lived experiences would be able to affect policy and systemic change in the areas where survivors most needed it. And it was just not a room full of policymakers making decisions for survivors with them not being present. And so that was the primary reason for which VOW was created, to lend that survivor voice.
Yeah, I'll echo that with what Raquel just mentioned. I'm really happy that at VOW, we have a continuum. We have, like, when you first join VOW, it's you're a member, you're more of a survivor, and you're just basically getting into our sisterhood and knowing who we are and the campaigns that we run and getting to know, like, the stuff around the gate. Not, you haven't really entered the gate as yet. And then from there, for me, I just specialize in a certain campaign. I specialize in housing because I felt that was one of the things that was most meaningful to me. And then I learned about housing and different housing laws, and I got educated on different things. So that's really what kind of sparked me into going into the domestic violence kind of industry, because I felt that my voice mattered and a lot of other voices matter. So that's really how we do a continuum in that way. And from there, we move on from survivor to advocate. And that means like you're out there, you might join something to go out to a you might go out to help somebody testify. You might just be a fly on the wall for some meeting. And then from there, you're like a community organizer. That means you're galvanizing people together, and you might attend different events and help to organize and really like get on the phone and talk to people, talk to public officials, things like that. And from there, you become a leader in a way that people might look to you for advice. Other survivors who are coming into the organization might look up to you for certain things they're going through. So that's really why I wanted to stay in this realm, because I felt like as you go through a continuum, then you gain knowledge and you make new friends, and you just you're kind of in that field, and you want to create the change. You want to see what's going on, and you want to be a part of it. So I'm happy to really do this work.
Great, thank you so much, Raquel and Charlena, for talking about just that it's the core of your work, and also how that motivation can look different as you take on different roles while you're doing the work. I think that's really great. Amanda, how about you in the center? What sparked yours in the center's motivation and your commitment to incorporate the expertise of people with lived experience as part of your work?
Absolutely. I think about it both in terms of internal and external influences. So I think internally, there was a clear commitment from myself and our board and our staff that we wanted to really focus on centering the voices and the experiences of particularly queer and trans people of color in the context of our work within the LGBTQ+ movement. And kind of simultaneously, we were hearing from our communities externally, specifically from LGBTQ people of color, that they wanted a dedicated space that didn't currently exist. And through our strategic planning process, as well as we were holding focus groups and sending out surveys, that was one of the consistent themes that came back, which was what resulted in racial justice being one of our 4 core pillars of that plan. So I think it was really a combination of both kind of an internal commitment across all levels within the center, and then really hearing and being responsive to the folks within our communities who were saying, this is what we need.
Thanks, Amanda. Amy, it looks like you're ready to chime in.
Sure. I mean, Downtown Women's Center has always centered our work around the expressed needs of the women, collected through, creating environments for their leadership opportunities, community-based research to discover needs that we could respond to. And in the creation of the Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition, we really want to make incredible change within our programs that still to this day create barriers for survivors. And we want to make systems change happen. And it doesn't work when I call another staff member in another program and say, like, maybe we should do this differently. It doesn't work in the same way that it does when you hear an advocate express how the programs failed them or what worked and what could be bolstered. And so in the creation of the coalition, it was essential that we create this space for listening to survivors. And that has impacted and motivated change for programs and elected officials, of which Lorraine's done all the work and all the change making.
With partnership. I am mostly bought into this because I know that the challenges that I face in the world are not just my challenges, but they're challenges for many others. So when I think about the journey of trying to navigate society and having a child with a disability and being suppressed in many areas of trying to work and being in a domestic violence relationship and being Black and all the things that layered on top, I realized that there was this innovative healing in social justice work. So when I was able to center myself in understanding, okay, this is a service and there's a lot of challenges with me getting my needs met. How do I get to partner with this service? And so I get to understand what their challenges are with meeting my needs. And then when I was so fired up and I'm like, okay, this is a space where there's a welcoming idea that I have for children that I care about and that our healing journey matters. So I couldn't just go and seek out the typical 9 to 5. Because I needed to be present for the healing journey of myself and my children. And so I needed flexibility. I needed a support. I needed that already trauma-informed lens where people were already prepared to understand that this is a survivor and the needs of the survivor is different than just filling out a W-9, being on a probationary period and, doing the task of the day. And I seen that it was beneficial for me, for my children, and then I seen other survivors and I was like, hey, come on over here. Come look and see what we're doing over here. Come get empowered, come be a part of this. And seeing the power in the collective voices and seeing the transitions in the way that women who support one another and kind of remove the stigmas of the shame and all the other things that come along with being survivors, I was totally bought in that we need to involve as many as who are ready and those who aren't ready to just hold space for them. Uh-oh.
You're good. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, Chris, do you have a question?
One thing that I just want to observe is that it seems like for all of you, this focus wasn't an add-on. It was like central from almost from the gate. And that's amazing. And I do think there probably are some organizations and people listening today and hearing your remarks and your experiences who are really wanting to incorporate this, getting this set up, because it hasn't been necessarily as central and as it has been in your experience and development. So I wonder if any of you could speak to how your survivor, just some of the mechanics of it, how your survivor advocate program or your person with lived experience program is set up, what roles that are available to people with lived experience, and just how you've gone about kind of structuring and making sure that there's that, institutional backbone that allows this to be happening. How did you get it set up? I'm kind of looking for anybody we don't necessarily have to go systematically through you all. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Okay, so we started with the idea that there had to be two models. Since we're community organizing, we believe those affected really changed the system. And so there had to be an internal model for survivor leadership development and an external model for organizing platform. So we at VOW don't believe that we empower anyone. Through organizing, you get the tools to self-empower. And so we don't own anyone's empowerment. Therefore, we don't own anybody's voice. And so for that, the survivor leadership model was really focused on core trainings of understanding what organizing is, who are the targets in organizing, what are the breakdowns and systemic breakdowns within the campaign. And let me start with a caveat. I recognize that we are 100% organizing. And so in that case, in starting a survivor involvement in your organization, it could be different. But just to give you some foundation, the idea was that how do we ensure that we prepare survivors for the rigors of organizing? Because it can be tough. It can be tough if you're a survivor who is now meeting with the chief administrative judge who actually managed your case, or that clerk who, has biases, or if you're actually speaking to Child Protective Services now about your experience when you felt that Child Protective Services re-victimized you. So the idea is to be able to provide them with these tools of training, and those tools of training include legislative training, it includes public speaking training, it includes training on how to manage your emotions, it includes trainings on understanding the landscape of policy within New York City. And it also includes a downtime, something that's called, we call it healing expressions, in which survivors come together to talk about nothing, has nothing to do with the campaigns. It has everything to do with just a promote of shared understanding that we're in this together and we're going to make systemic change. The model grows over time. And as Charlene gave you the continuum of survivor to leader, the model is meant for leadership development. It is meant for leadership ladder, internally and externally. The model internally is meant for those survivors who want to take on more roles within VOW. So at VOW, in addition to the survivor leadership model, we have a steering committee of survivors who work with the members. We also have a board who works with the members of directors. All of this is through our leadership development. We do a leadership ladder based off of where the survivor wants to be involved. So we have 3 campaigns. We have these campaign meetings monthly. We have a steering committee, which manages leadership development, and we have a board, which clearly focuses that the survivors lead the organizing platform, not the board, even if they are members, because your roles change, you assume different levels of power, and you need to know when to check your power. And so that is most important within what we do. The external is for us that we want at VOW as many survivors in leadership roles as possible. So as staff, we're in the background pushing for these survivors to be in leadership roles, whether it be committees, task forces, whether it be speaking engagements, everything to get the voice of the survivor out. Now, in starting this, our suggestion would be first you figure out what you can do and what survivors want to do. You can't formulate it yourself. To identify what you want to do and starting some form of survivor involvement in your organization, you first have to figure out what survivors feel that they need and what would they like to do with your organization. That would be my suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Raquel. Amy, I know you and Lorraine have some things to add to this.
I feel like Lorraine should go first.
Go, Lorraine. You've got
Okay. So one thing that I love to highlight is the allyship. So matching a survivor with the system leader to understand how systems work, and so that system leaders can understand more from the context of them constantly engaging with the survivor, how they could influence systems change. I love that motto. It has been one that's the advocates have brought highlights to how it has empowered them to have this system leader show up in different platforms of them speaking and sharing. There's our groups that we kind of break out to where survivors could be a part of the training and education. So that's where we partner with LASA, who is the continuum of care and allows for a lot of grant fundings to go out to homeless service providers. And that gives opportunity for the voice of the survivors to train and educate the service providers, which is really unique to see a room full of service providers hearing from the direct voice of the survivor, how their current system design, their services design and program design can be changed. And then them walking out of the room feeling very hopeful that there is changes, and then later on hearing that there has been changes that have been made due to their voice. There's also, we've done the support survivors by survivors, where there's been that space where the survivors just sit with each other and kind of hear, what is your next speaking engagement? Or how was that last speaking engagement for you? And debriefing that with one another. There's also the opportunities. So we've held a few conferences, major conferences, and we center the survivors in those. We've done some really creative things with having them build on their confidence and self-esteem through photo shoots and wardrobe. Yeah, it was a lovely day where it was more than a day. I feel really bad for the organizer, but like every day of a week, she brought all these beautiful clothing items from inventory of the Downtown Women's Center to a room where the advocates could put on what makes them feel most powerful as they participate in a conference. I think things like that, just being really personal with understanding how does one really feel empowered. And once a very simple thing Amy led us in was a power pose right before going in and talking to our decision makers. And we've taken that in many, many different areas of our work where we will just stop and power pose and give ourselves the boost for our next speaking engagement. We also do this like preparation for a collective message for public comments. It's really helpful, but we encourage the survivors to connect their personal experiences and stories to the scripted messaging that will allow for us to all have that collective voice when we speak to public comment. So that's just a few things. If you spent some time with us, you would see that there's people that are on boards, there's people that are doing consulting work, there's a lot of amazing stuff coming out of these advocates.
Wonderful. Anything to add, Amy, before I go to Amanda?
No, that was great.
You said it all, Lorraine. So I know that, the preparation, the training, the support that goes along with that has been really, really integral. Amanda, I wonder if you've got things to add about how you've really worked to make the integration of voices of people from the LGBTQ community into your program's work.
Absolutely. So kind of building off of what others have talked about, the way we've approached this is really focusing on leadership and decision-making structures as one of the ways to really intentionally center racial justice and the voices of those who are most marginalized within our LGBTQ plus communities. And so two kind of tangible examples of that. One is our Queer and Trans People of Color Advisory Group, so QTPOC group for short. And so this, as I had sort of alluded to earlier, sort of came out of the confluence of this commitment from our board and our staff that we wanted to kind of put some more tangible mechanisms in place to center racial equity. And at the same time, hearing from our queer and trans people of color communities that they wanted and needed a dedicated space. And so our QTPOC group, which was formed in 2018, really fulfills both of those functions. So it is an exclusive space for queer and trans people of color that meets together, provides support to one another, plans and implements programming for their communities. But it also serves as an advisory arm to our board of directors. And it was really important to us that the QTPOC liaison position that we created, so a member of that group that is selected by the group, sits on our board of directors and is a full voting member. And it was really important that that not just be like window dressing, not just be kind of, we often hear about like advisory roles that don't have power behind them. So it was important to us that there be power in decision-making attached to that. But we also, that person functions as a full board member in every sense, except that we don't have the same fundraising requirements that we do for other board members, because we didn't want that to be a potential barrier if someone wanted to step into that role in leadership. So that's been a really important kind of tangible piece that we've put in place to both create the dedicated space that our communities were asking for and also have that group really be holding our board of directors and our organization accountable, particularly as a white executive director. Feeling like that's really important as we are seeking to move forward our strategic goals around racial justice. And so we check in with that group and through that liaison whenever there are big decisions coming up. I mean, that person is in our board meetings regardless, but if there are specific things we'd like them to bring back to the full QTPOC group, we do that kind of on an ongoing basis, just to be checking in and getting that feedback, particularly around things that, may be more complex or where there's a lot of different opinions. So that's one thing that we've put in place. The other more recent piece is with GLOW, which is our new community space specifically for LGBTQ plus men of color and transgender women of color. There's a GLOW Youth Advisory Board that was started really at the very beginning of that process. So the program has been open a year, but the development goes back to 2 years ago. And so part of the model that we were using is participant-centered. And so really at the very beginning of that process, we started a youth advisory board and specifically we're inviting members of those priority communities to be part of it. And so that board has really influenced everything about the program development as we've built it from the ground up. So they were part of the search committees for staff interviews. They went with us with a realtor to evaluate sites and deciding what physical building the space would be in. They continue to evaluate programming and decide, hey, this program is not working. This is what we should do instead. Really at every aspect of programming and operations, that group of people who represent those priority communities for the program are having meaningful input into the work that is being done. And even as we have an administrative group amongst the 4 community organizations that partner on this program, but regularly, if we're discussing something at that administrative group, we'll say, hey, let's take this back to the YAB to get their input. So that's been also another structure that we put in place that has been really valuable.
That's great. And I'm hearing a few threads in what you all have said. One is, don't create something and then ask people to join it. Create what they say they want, and go with that as your first step. The other thing I heard was don't just seek advice, but actually act on advice. To have an advisory role that never has any kind of decision-making power connected to it is really kind of an empty way to try to involve people. And you all three programs spoke to really attending to the people with lived experience who you're embracing into the work, the whole person approach. We have another question that you've kind of already jumped into, which is, how do you support people? And you're all already speaking to that as such an integral part of every step that you take. So the times where you have people gathering just to gather and you're not doing any work, the chance to select wardrobe, really looking at the whole person as you're working to really make this meaningful for folks. So I heard those three threads in what you were talking about. I just wanted to name them. Thanks, everybody. Over to you, Louie.
Yeah, wow. It's really neat to hear different programs doing different things, but getting those common themes. That's really exciting. And I just wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you, maybe not necessarily as individuals, but maybe as individuals, but how you and your programs and your organizations respond if and when the involvement that we're talking about triggers any kind of trauma. How have you worked through that? What have you set up in advance? Maybe any anecdotal stories that you would share with our group around that. What happens and how do you respond if and when the involvement that we're talking about triggers trauma? I'll follow Chris's lead and say, whoever wants to get us started should go ahead and do that.
I loved what Raquel added from her program, the healing circle. I forget the exact term that you used, but we have found that, from the get-go, creating that really in our program, we've done the skills-based training on here's how you pass a motion or a bill and here's the elected officials, but really the emotional needs have been more in the co-designing process, present and more expressed need for that support. And one thing that we did early on and consistently was bring up education around trauma, and just acknowledging that as trauma survivors, naming it, that things could become triggering and trying to create avenues of what to do if something is triggering and how to prevent that, how to talk about it as it's happening. I mean, we've had some group dynamics that have been incredibly triggering to each other. And as we've worked through it, you can see how it's created deeper bonds with each other, deeper bonds of understanding. But I guess my main point is that starting with education on trauma has been really helpful. And in fact, in the focus groups that we've done that started our coalition, we published a report on focus groups across Los Angeles County. One main theme that we heard was that once survivors learned about more education around trauma, the impacts on your brain, moving it more into a medical understanding, that really helped people. So we have focused a lot on education and describing and coming up with what we mean by trauma-informed care together.
Yeah, I second that. And I like to always bring it back to the power of self-awareness. So when we are practicing grounding techniques and becoming more self-aware of how we feel in our bodies when we've been triggered, then it gives us a better opportunity to navigate those triggers, because we get to say, oh, this felt like this. and learning how to communicate that with the person that has some involvement in bringing these opportunities to talk. And I have to magnify the talk because as survivors, we can also become perpetrators. And that could look like excluding someone or making comments that we are intentionally knowing that this comment could harm someone else. And so as we become more self-aware of how we experience triggers and how the impact on another person is showing up and how that breaks down the group dynamic, then we become more empowered to be the ones to foster the healing within ourselves and within the group. The other thing is having the core team. So I'm a part of the core team along with Amy and Elizabeth from Rainbow Services and Eve from the county and someone from LASA. Like there's these representatives that sit in the core team. And as we are looking at how the coalition is growing or is stagnant, we get to bring those matters to the coalition and we get to ask, so do you know anyone who could help us in the area of like conflict resolution or understanding the positives that come out of conflict? And I really appreciate that Amy brought up that there's been this closeness that comes after you've went through this transition of having a triggering moment or having some challenges like this, coming from a survivor's aspect of looking at how we have constantly been faced with this inner critic due to having a relationship, a really intimate relationship, and opening ourselves up to trust someone who caused harm to us. And then having that as a life experience that we're constantly navigating. And then we're coming into a group where it tells us already that women aren't supposed to be supportive of one another, that women are, there's many societal messagings, even with looking at the video from the beginning, having this conflict be the thing that builds on a healthy relationship, it changes our ability to see that there's a possibility in the world that there are people who care, and there's a possibility for healthy relationships. And I'm really glad that the group is doing this and supporting each other and working through the challenges.
Okay, I want to hop in right after Lorraine and Amy, and I just want to say that I echo on a lot of things that you guys are bringing up, and I want to give a flip side to triggering and how that can also manifest as like this is the step before, like that triggersome moment is a step before something great is about to happen. So in my past, I lived in a domestic violence shelter, and I was a single in a shelter, which in New York City, it's hard to find shelter space for singles, mostly accommodating to families. So I was in the shelter, and in that shelter, there was only one spot for singles with, I think, maybe 23 spots for families in that specific shelter. And I want to bring this up because a couple of people in the room are from domestic violence shelters or from shelters in general. So giving a hello to you. At the time I was there, I was kind of lonely, and my neighbor knocked on the door, and she said, and I thought she was like, trying to be friendly. I really thought, she wanted to get to know me. And like 10 minutes into the conversation, she says, okay, well, how long do you think you're going to be here? Because my friend, she's a single and she doesn't have any children, and she needs a place to stay, and she's a survivor. And at that point, I was like, how are you questioning me on how long I'm going to be here? There's already systemic things in place making it so that I can only be here for a certain period of time, and you want to shorten my time, and you're my next door neighbor. So I was definitely triggered at that moment, and I felt more alone. I slammed the door on her and I felt more alone at that point. And from there, I said, there's got to be a way that I can connect with other families here, even though I'm not with children. And I'm sure what she said is something that other people were thinking. So, but did not say or have the balls to say. So I met, it happened to be around Mother's Day. And I said, you know what, I really like cooking. So maybe we can do like a Mother's Day event. And I went up to the shelter director and I asked if I can have money to buy food and put on a Mother's Day event and work with the kids that were in the shelter. Like, we got the kids to cook breakfast and we had menus and we did like a whole event plan. And then we invited the mothers to come down and have breakfast. So it was more like the kids were serving their mom. And from there, I knew that like this, like it was a success and it went through, and the director was very good and very helpful to make it a success. And also other people got to know me. So they got to know that, okay, let's do this more often. Like, let's have a weekly food night where we can all cook and, you know, eat and maybe go food shopping. And that brought together people in the shelter to lead, and also like other women did cooking nights, and we took advantage of these kinds of things. And from there, and that one triggering thing sparked really a lot of things that are happening right now in my life. So from there, somebody who worked in the shelter asked me if I'd like to volunteer to work at another women's shelter and just volunteer my time to teach cooking lessons, which I did. I did it for 2 years, non-paid, and I really wanted to like get some support, like really just keep the energy going with food, because I thought food really brought people together. And then from there, I was able to, with the support of Val, I was able to make connections to get a grant to work with the juvenile detention system, which has a lot of intersections with domestic violence, and teach cooking skills to youth who are incarcerated. So and I felt that bringing all of that together, like I got to do something that I love to do, and I'm affecting people that are like me, that could be like me. And all it takes is that leap from a trigger something to push it forward. And you never know who's going to help you while you're on that journey. So we always encourage at Val to, try to, talk about what you're good at and how you can bring that into the organization. And also that can also lead to getting out of economic poverty. As Lorraine mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of people, you want to help people, but you got to help people financially as well. And sometimes it takes that person to realize their own self-worth, how much they value yourself, and building on that stuff. It takes patience, and it also takes dedication on you. So that's how I was able to do a few things that I liked out of a very low part in my life.
So the main thing at Val is we have each other's backs. Let's just be real. That's just the way we are. And so that is the way we work. I mean, I myself was a victim of a false and malicious child abuse report. And Val members stepped in and walked me along that path. So having each other's back is very clear at Val, because the work we do, staff is staff, volunteers are members, and they're coming in volunteering their time. They're rehashing these experiences they had. They're talking to people who may have seen as on the other side of the table, not willing to help them. So we try to recognize that everyone's space is different, but also recognize that everyone's time is important. And so to talk about that question about support, we really adopt the transformative justice model of pod mapping. And so that is, who is your pod when you're in this space? Who's your supportive system? One, is it members? Do you in that pod that you need to fill, and you can fill it with VAL members. And that includes me as the executive director, that includes a board member, that includes anyone. So we are fortunate to have members who started VAL still active in VAL. And so we're talking about members who've been a part of VAL for 20 years. And so that space of, that pod mapping is very important for us to be supportive to each other. And that is the way we manage triggers, emotions, emotionally, internally. Externally, because of the fact that VAL members go out and attend these meetings on their own on behalf of VAL, task forces, committee meetings, appointments to special committees, we check in after that and want to know how it went, what needs to be followed up on, if they feel something needs to be followed on, and how they felt in that space. And there have been times when they have felt uncomfortable, but they haven't wanted to step away from it. They wanted to do their own self-empowerment. And so in that space, we identify a VAL member or a staff member who's going to attend with them. Because we always want to make sure that voice is there, but we also need to support the survivor where they're at that moment. And that doesn't mean they won't say, Raquel, I got this a couple weeks from now. It's just right now, they need that support, and we're there to support you.
Just to add to that from my perspective, I think in our work with GLOW, one of the things that has become really clear is that often our youth advisory board members and our staff, particularly our peer engagement staff members, are experiencing or have experienced the same types of trauma as our participants within those priority communities. And so I remember really clearly one of the planning meetings at the beginning before GLOW had even opened, where it was, all of our partners around the table, but also youth advisory board members and some of the newly hired staff, and two of them who are very much within our priority communities got really emotional at one point, and were just, crying and expressing both how amazing it felt to be creating this space, but also talking about, experiences with homelessness that they had both had, and just, all that carries. And so I think, part of it in moments like that is just creating the space to hold that, you throw the agenda out the window, because this is really important when people are sharing those lived experiences. But beyond those particular moments, I think it's also been really important for us to think about compensation and how we're really tangibly valuing people's time and that emotional labor that they're bringing. And so ensuring that our youth advisory board members are compensated through gift cards for each of their monthly meetings and for certain other activities that they do above and beyond, ensuring that our staff, particularly our youth or our peer engagement specialist positions, are getting a living wage, more than a living wage, for the work that they're doing within their own communities. And that we're really listening, as we continue to build the program to what the emerging needs are. And that's part of how, our case manager at GLOW was one of the first people who had brought up, we've got to do something around housing, even though that's not something that is allowable under our current funding streams. And so, from that, we've been having conversations and have started fundraising for an emergency housing fund and building a policy and procedure around that. And so really, from the lived experiences of our staff, of our youth advisory board members and of our participants, holding space for that, compensating and valuing people's time, but then, having that influence the programming that we're building and fundraising for.
This was great. Thanks. Oh, go ahead, Ricky. Please.
Just about the compensation, we feel that it's really important that survivors be compensated. And so for us, we do provide stipends for our internal meetings. Survivors do facilitations outside. So it is more money for those types of meetings, taking their time. We've also have been really good at making New York City feel extremely uncomfortable about their task forces and the fact that individuals around that room are making so much more than survivors that you need to start providing some compensation. And so we have been successful in pushing that in New York City. So we do believe, you know, survivors owning their story, owning their experience, and it's a part of their own self-empowerment.
Thanks for adding that, Raquel. Yeah, just thanks so much for all this. Love the theme of supporting each other, having each other's backs, both as part of the fabric of like the culture and the way that we do things, and for offering some of those specific examples of how to do that. So yeah, I think that was a really rich conversation. And Chris, I'm going to pass it to you for our next prompt.
I'll just say yay for catalyzing discomfort. Raquel, that was great. So this has been threaded throughout the conversation today, but I want to ask you all specifically about impact. How has having survivors, people with lived experience in so many places, sitting at so many tables and taking so many roles, how has that impacted on your program, on the people that your program serves and is working for, and on the survivors or people with lived experience themselves in taking that involvement? What can you share more than you already have about impact? Results that you've seen, changes that you've seen, transformations that you've seen.
Yeah, Lorraine's sort of spoken to this. Of all the advocates that we've trained, they are now all in additional leadership roles. One is on the board of directors of a statewide nonprofit. Many are on our HUD Continuum of Care committees through what's been mentioned as LAHSA, LA Homeless Services Authority. We now have members sitting on our city task forces for domestic violence and our county task forces. They're keynoting at conferences and doing lots of panel presentations and available for consultation. So it's been exciting to see this kind of become like an entrepreneurial program and to figure out ways to support that. It was so exciting when the woman who joined the board of directors announced, and then she really leaned on the group for support to prepare her for those first meetings. So that's, you know, some personal outcomes. On a policy level, though, they've really, especially this year, unfortunately, a success we've had this year is in maintaining our existing funding. But given all the cuts related to COVID, that is quite a feat. And I feel that our advocates did a really good job early on saying, like, this is an absolute area that cannot be cut. We had a growth area in starting a whole hotel program, and the advocates provided all the training so that staff members knew how to, you know, meet the needs of survivors. And then our basic policy platform is advancing the domestic violence housing first model. And we've seen massive success in that in terms of the scaling of that program across California, in part due to the expressed survivor need of flexible funding, and that our coalition has given up their data, and we've been able to demonstrate through numbers the impact of the program.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like the systems that you're working with, it's just a given now that they're going to be hearing survivors' voices. They're going to be mm-hmm. hearing people with lived experience. It's just part of the process from here. Yeah. You've made it, you put it so
And fun. I have, sorry to interrupt, I've seen a shift in Los Angeles in particular of many decision makers and elected saying, like, well, if you didn't demonstrate that you showed the survivor voice? Like, they're asking, mm-hmm. what do they want? Like, they're kind of like, you didn't, like, you're sort of nothing to me if you didn't bring that voice forward, with some of our most progressive and aligned mm-hmm. elected officials.
What else about impact? And this can be on you all personally as well. If those are, do you have some things that you want to share about that? or the communities that you're serving?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Raquel. All right. So I'll just, a couple of things that come to mind for me. So on the LGBTQ center side, I think some of the ways we've seen impact has been around commitments we've made to have, for example, half of our board at least as Black or brown people, and how that's influenced who is at that table, in addition to the QTPOC liaison position, you know, who else is around that table and how those conversations are impacted by that in terms of what we're talking about and the decisions that are being made around the direction of the center. I think also we've seen how it's impacted our hiring process. So we took some time, last year to put together an anti-racist hiring process based on some of the work that AORTA at the national level has done and a toolkit that they developed. And so that's influenced, you know, who we have on staff and not only who we have on staff, but how that process works and who is at the table and how their voices are really being centered, particularly Black and brown people through that. And so it's really changing, you know, the DNA of our center through those processes and those commitments that are resulting in a different mix of people that are at those tables and making decisions. At GLOW, I think, you know, we wouldn't have been able to build a successful program without the Youth Advisory Board and the folks on staff who represent the lived experiences of our priority communities. You know, it simply wouldn't have been possible because so much of what we've seen is that people from our priority communities are coming to GLOW because they know someone who's on the Youth Advisory Board. They know someone who's on staff. And that's the point, right? That that's why we're constructing it that way. You know, if it had been people who looked like me, we wouldn't have had a successful program. And I think, you know, particularly in a year with a pandemic like this, you know, having to do all of that virtually. You know, GLOW is not quite a year old, but we had 14 participants when we opened last December, and this past month we had 57. And so I know Harrisburg is much smaller than some of the larger cities represented here in terms of numbers, but that growth is something that we're really proud of. And having done that through a year where so much of our work has had to be virtual as well.
That's great. And we got a question in the chat box. If you could type in the name of that toolkit that you referred to, that people are interested in seeing that. Thanks, Amanda. Charlene or Raquel, you have anything to add? Impact?
Before I have Raquel go, I just wanted to highlight something that we have done. Thank you, Amanda, for that mention on a toolkit. Brewing from there, if you have openings at your establishment or at your organization, one quick thing you can do to really like spearhead that economic change when it comes to survivorship is at the bottom of your applications, just put in quote, "We encourage survivors to apply." Just put that out there. We encourage survivors to apply. That way, survivors can see that this is a peer kind of model, that we're here to support you. We understand where you're coming from, and we also know that it is important for your lens to be a part of our work. And also, applications can be just daunting. So you putting that out there can eliminate some fears in applying for a job, because this could be something that they're moving into a different industry, or they really don't have the levels of experience that they think they need. And just putting that out there gives a little bit of a boost of encouragement to, you know, that we hear you and we want you to be a part of our team. And Raquel, please.
So I'm like so psyched Charlene said that, because that's like super important at VAL. We're consistently saying, did you put that at the bottom of that job description and with the other things you put at the bottom? So for us, VAL, Val's initial impact was that survivors have seats at the table. That's not enough for us now. It's survivors have leadership roles at those tables. And so when we are asked to participate, we always ask, so how many co-chairs are there? Will a survivor be a co-chair? How many survivors are going to be on? We've seen the 60, which is survivors, 40% direct service providers at every meeting, if not more survivors. And yeah, it's a lot to take in for some, but it is the expectation completely is that the lived experience is what will transform policy to be more responsive to survivors and their children and their networks. And so with that being said, we continue to push that mantra with us. And so for impact, survivors have been extremely impactful throughout New York City, extremely impactful during the pandemic. And I think that's something to bring up, is that when, the pandemic hit New York City, survivors are very clear that the safety valves for survivors are going to be gone. And what exactly are we going to do? And we need to right now get to the mayor's office. And they're a little unorganized right now, and they need to, shape up here. And so the idea then was, how do we include, or how do we break down a nonprofit industrialization complex during COVID, to be honest with you? How do we include those small organizations that are working in the Bronx, that are working in Brooklyn, that are never at these tables, but right now need to be at these tables more than anyone else at this table right now, because they don't have the resources or the brand that you have. But they are out there helping people right now on the ground. And so that really became our push, was that more smaller organizations be at the table, more survivor organizations be at the table. Survivors start to create their own survivors domestic violence task force. We don't always need the cities, so we can create our own and then begin to look at policy the way it needs to be looked at to advocate for systemic change. And the idea is that every survivor coming to the table has something to bring, and also a form of self-interest that they want to change something. And so with that idea, we kicked off the Survivor Policy Lab for survivors to connect with organizations focusing on core main areas of criminalization of survivors, focusing on survivors in child welfare, focus on survivors in the criminal justice system, that not specifically with criminalization of survivors, but dealing with the everyday behaviors and attitudes. So for us, our impact is continual, more survivor policy change, more survivor-led policy change at the city, the state, and the federal level. It all has to come together to ensure that survivors have the impact they need to help future survivors.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to move to our oh, Lorraine, did you have something to add?
Yes. Looking at impact, thinking about how America was built on this motto of violence that was mainly perpetrated against people of color, and thinking about how my community is, how my growing up, there was this idea that it was normalized for people of color to whoop, to create some type of abuse that will have this control over how the next person does something that they would want them to do. And I've seen a huge impact from being very transparent and very honest. I have 4 children, 3 who are much older than my youngest. And the 3 older usually say, Royalty, if you had my mom, this would have not happened, or you wouldn't be saying that, or this and this and this. But I see the difference in Royalty's ability to navigate in the world based on the shift in me understanding how violence affects a human being and this idea of power and control. So I'm going to throw this out there, hoping that someone will be able to catch it, because what I've seen in Royalty, being able to accept the motto of therapy and mental well-being, and just self-care practices is way different than my 3 older children. They say that children who have witnessed domestic violence need at least 5 healthy adult relationships in their lives. My older children, they call themselves socially awkward. They will not reach out. They will like plunge through the hardships without telling anyone what's happening. When the younger one, he'll be like, in a minute, he'll say, Mom, is Granny angry because she's like really moody right now? And I want to understand, like, was she abused? Like, he asks things like this, which changes the way that he gets to experience the world. And it also empowers him in the way that he reacts when there's these encounters with other Black men. We'll be at the park, right? And we'll see another family, and the mom will tell the boy, it's usually the boy who's been pressed upon and said, boys don't cry, don't be a crybaby. And Royalty will go and he'll say to him, it's okay to cry. Your mom may not understand. But these are the impacts that I'm seeing that could change the way that children of color have normalized abuse. And this is like getting to the root of how domestic violence is perpetrated. And I'm looking to build up what Royalty is experiencing as some type of curriculum, some type of motto, something that will go out to children in schools, to other parents, to just take it much broader on how he's experiencing the world and the ways that we've kind of been able to troubleshoot through the challenges and not have to use the motto of causing harm to someone to get them to do what you want them to do, especially in the communities of color where it's, do you know who I am? I'm your mama and you better do what I say type of thing. So I see the impact. Royalty is amazing. And I'm looking to use this opportunity of how he's been able to verbalize things and to share out this motto with other families so that the root of violence is disrupted.
I'm so glad you added that. Thank you, LaRue. We talked about internal change, external change, next generational change, societal change. Yes, social justice. All right, thank you so much. And we're down to just a few minutes. So Louis has just one final question.
Yeah, so this has been so great. I know we could talk about this topic for a long time, clearly. And but since we just have a few minutes left, I wonder if our panelists would leave our audience with just like one thing that you would say to a program that's exploring this idea right now, or any one piece of final wisdom that you want to put out there in like, like maybe less than a minute each.
I would encourage folks to really make sure you have the capacity to do the work, that you have dedicated staff or volunteers or advocates to take it on. It's not just like in other duties as assigned role, it's like a real role that takes a lot of time for lots of individual and group conversations and coordination, and it really is at least at minimum a full-time role.
I would just say that this work can't be done in isolation. So, particularly when we're talking about centering the voices of and experiences of marginalized people in, organizational development and change. Yeah, it can't just be kind of a siloed initiative. It has to be part of a broader organizational strategy embedded in the mission, vision, and values, a commitment at all levels of leadership that will really make it successful.
I'd like to say people are valuable. And if you have the ability to give a platform, a foundation to their value, please do so.
I'm going to say what was mentioned before, the importance of debriefing. It's really important after every event, after every, little, even if it's a little thing that happened, just to have that one-on-one debrief with the person so you can see where people are coming from and start to make change for the next steps that are going to happen. Debriefing is really, really key.
I will echo with what everyone else said. I think that's really the crux of it. You just gotta want to do it. You have to want to do it. That's it.
Great place to end. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists, everyone who participated in the chat. Thank you so much to Megan for doing the captioning today. I didn't mention your name earlier. I apologize for that, Megan. Thank you so much. You can reach out to us through the Safe Housing Partnerships website, and we can continue this dialogue. And Chris, would you send us off?
Yeah, I just don't want it to end. So, you know, part of me wants to just extend it for another hour or something. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your valuable time. I know everybody's going to come away from this buzzing with, you know, the energy about how to take this forward. And thank you so much. We really appreciate all that you've shared today. And thank you for all who came. I hope we can keep this dialogue going.